right, welcome everyone to PESI's Veterans Day Military and Veteran Mental Health Panel discussion. I have with us here three of our experts. I've got George Fowler, Wyatt Evans, and Ben Keizer. I will kick off here with a few questions and open it up for discussion amongst you guys. So the first kind of question we had for you is, what are some of the unique issues that you all see military service members and veterans experiencing that therapists can help with? And it's open for anybody to take and then run from there.
Well, I think it's interesting because, first of all, just the experience of being military in the culture that we live in, there's kind of growing research that the civilian community doesn't understand sort of the unique job requirements that go along with the military. And kind of what we're seeing now too is, we've had a nation at war for 20 years and sort of this global war on terrorism, or GWOT. And now that's pretty much ending in terms of that sustained conflict. And so now there's this real sense of, okay, we were valuable to you during this time. Now that's over with, but yet a lot of the behavioral health, mental health issues kind of persist along with that after they came back. So just sort of understanding where they come from, and that there is a different culture there.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. George and Wyatt, do you guys have anything additional to add or any thoughts on top of that?
Yeah, I think most therapists don't recognize that therapy is often betraying their training. Right? I mean, you get all this training to not engage, to not process your feelings, to not be curious about your reality. And then all of a sudden you come into this therapy office and all of a sudden you're supposed to do these things you've been trained not to do. So, just to honor and the pacing of the therapist, I think super important.
I mean, we know that the prevalence rates of PTSD, substance use disorders, chronic pain, just about you name it, are higher among veterans and service members than the civilian population. So I think therapists and our skill sets are well positioned to respond to this need. And yes, what these other guys have said are really important. There's a cultural competence that's required to be able to respond to these experiences that maybe, yes, we have training in, but to be able to respond to them effectively with this population. Some of the things that get bad raps among psychologists, among therapists, let's take emotional suppression, for example. That's a bad thing, right? Well, not necessarily. For my folks, emotional suppression may have been the thing that kept them alive once upon a time. And to come in swinging, saying that's a bad thing, that's a maladaptive coping strategy, that's a quick way to invalidate their experience and destroy any hope of building rapport. So that cultural competence is a really important part of, I think, taking a skill set we already have, many of us, but then adapting it to be able to respond effectively to the people sitting in front of us now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I hear a lot from the patients talking about, well, they don't necessarily expect that you understand everything they went through, but they want to see the two C's. Are you curious about their experiences? And kind of going along with that, vitamin C, do you care? Does the therapist show a genuine concern and care for the person and their outcome? And, these are people that are pretty sensitive, BS meters. They know if you're not being genuine. They understand if you're just sort of going through the motions. And if you're not sort of fully committed to sort of that curiosity and caring, regardless of your skill set, it may not be the outcome that you expect therapeutically.
Yeah, I really like that two C's, the curiosity and caring. I think that's really important for people to keep in mind as they're interacting with this population. And I think that's this part of the conversation is a good segue into kind of my next question, which is how important do you think the specialized training in military culture and related issues is to military service members and veterans seeking therapy? And why you kind of touched on that a little bit, but how much specialized training, what areas do people need to be better attuned to and trained in to provide better care?
I'll jump on that first. I mean, I think our field has done a lot better job around diversity, equity, inclusivity, right? If we don't do our work, then we're going to burden our clients to have to do the work for us, right? And it puts them in a pretty unfair position. Why would it be any different with the military culture, right? They have some really unique ways of showing up. And if we're not curious about, I mean, I think every therapist wants to be curious, but, a lack of awareness is going to kind of block that. So in my experience as a supervisor, I think so many therapists have great intent, but so many therapists, we're like vulnerability junkies. We measure success by the number of tissues we hand out in session. I mean, most of the world doesn't operate this way. So like you could have a good intent, but you just get out in front of your clients and you wind up pushing them and eliciting all their defenses. And, so I do think that work that we need to do is, again, super important for the pacing of the session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think regionally too, just understanding who are the people that are coming and seeing you. Geographically, do you live close to a naval base? Are you close to the Air Force? Are you close to the Army, Coast Guard? Sort of take stock of who are the people that are coming in the door, and Google's your friend. There's a lot of information out there. Just understanding the difference, for example, if you're enlisted, between an MOS, military occupational specialty, and the AFSC and the Air Force. It's the same thing, but it's just, even just knowing the difference can make a big, I think, difference in how much rapport you're able to gain with the patient to understand, like, hey, are you at least willing to try to understand where I come from, or you just kind of give up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think foundational curiosity is essential. If you don't have that, you probably ought not to be sitting with service members and veterans. From there, though, every bit of work you can do to cultivate that cultural competence is going to serve you and serve them, allow you to serve them well. Anything you can do to cultivate that knowledge base, like Ben was just alluding to, is going to set you up for success. And don't be afraid to ask. You don't have to be prior service. You don't have to know. If you happen to be, that tends to be kind of helpful. And before I had that information readily available to me, when I didn't know, and I said, there you go with your acronym again. What's that one? And do so in a compassionate, curious way. That usually is well received. A little bit of banter there. It actually builds rapport. It doesn't tend to be damaging. I mean, I can't say that with an absolute certainty 100% of the time, but I find that's a usually a workable strategy. But doing the cultural competence training, whether it be through PESI or through any other platform, any other outlet, then you don't have to ask, and that's going to set you up for success. Although I say that, and I feel like I need to double back and put in the caveat that was just sort of alluded to, which is that there are massive cultural differences between and among the branches of service, between and among the occupations within the military, between and among junior enlisted, senior enlisted officers, et cetera. And so there's still more nuanced understanding to build, even once you have that foundational awareness as well.
Yeah, and that was kind of my next question, was on that rapport building stuff. And it sounds like kind of one of the main components there would be that doing that background, research almost, and knowing, what branch they came from, what the culture in that branch is, and maybe, even seniority wise, rank and things like that, what might play into, who they are kind of as a person and what their experience was. That all kind of goes into building that rapport, is knowing that background info.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so.
Well, I think just the military experience and understanding it's however you want to view it, a semi-closed or semi-open structure. So, you get placed into a position. You don't get to put in your 2-week notice. And so you're very subjected to the leadership structure of that. So just really exploring that. What was their experience like that? I mean, there's been some research showing that toxic leadership, increases your chances of potential suicide attempts. I think that's what's unique, right, compared to the civilian structure. And these toxic leadership experiences stick with them. And there's a lot of guilt there. Why does this still bother me? This was something I was assigned to, but there's a real sense of loyalty and trust that occurs within that culture. And so, really, I think working on the trust factor. So if you tell a military veteran patient you're going to do something, you better follow through with that, right? Because they're looking that you're going to do the same things that they would do for you. And if they can trust you, now you're opening up much more possibilities. If you lose that trust with them, it's very, very difficult to gain it back, in my experience.
I notice it starts with showing up on time for the session. I mean, it's so easy in many practice settings to just get a little bit behind, just a little bit behind, and it doesn't seem like a big deal. And to a civilian, it might not be. We're all used to sitting in the doctor's waiting room for an hour. But to a service member, to a veteran, that's unacceptable. That's a breach of trust, oftentimes. And showing up on time is a demonstration of trustworthiness. And so it starts with showing up on time. And then from there, it's not calling a Marine a soldier. It's just knowing these subtle differences. And then the thing that I most notice myself attending to is validating that which has been consistently invalidated since they left the service. Now I'm talking about working with my veterans, some of whom have been, in therapy for months, years, decades, by the time that they're sitting down with me, and their suppression as a coping strategy, their drinking habits, their anger as a response to quote unquote weaker emotions, has been responded to by folks in their lives, maybe even previous therapists, being pointed to as maladaptive, as wrong, as unacceptable. And the minute I validate that as, this made sense once upon a time, contextually, it was not only logical, it was reasonable, it was appropriate, it was effective, it was maybe essential for well-being and survival. That earns me a lot of brownie points rapport-wise. From there, I can potentially then begin to point to the unworkability of those very same strategies in the new context that they're living in, having pointed to and validated the very real utility of those things once upon a time. But we can't come in swinging just because it's not serving them well now.
Let me jump in on that, Wyatt. I think super helpful to honor, right, these adaptive survival strategies, right? So things that they're coming into the session with, but it's really important for the therapist to be ready to catch them in session, right? These moves to try to avoid going to places of pain or fear or vulnerability. So when they make a joke or they focus on something positive or they deflect, or you ask them what they feel and they start talking about their partner, like these are all real-time ways of emotional regulation. I mean, trauma, PTSD is a failure of emotions, right? Regulation. So how do we help them have more success with co-regulation, right? They're always alone to deal with these things. So I love that idea of just waiting for opportunities to say, hey, I love how you laugh. That just lets me know you're taking a little space here, because space is what you've done your whole life to feel safe. So in session, like helping make it the implicit explicit, help them see their strategies as they're unfolding in real time, and then giving them success with those strategies. I think that's really what moves the needle.
Yeah, and totally agree with that. And one thing that I've seen noted a lot is just, to me, trust, and the other one's toughness. That there has to be some toughness and ability to tolerate themes that you may or may not be comfortable with. You may not have seen. I had a patient come into me recently, upset. He's a co-occurring trauma and chronic pain patient. And he said, I asked him, well, what happened in your previous 2 sessions? He said, well, I'd made both my therapists cry and it was just too emotional for them. And so I couldn't continue on with it. And I think that's such a strong theme to illustrate that, because they're looking for that. And they're scared, regardless of what you see. Don't believe this, that they're just as scared, fearful, anxious, just because they present as tough or strong. And they're looking for you to help kind of guide them through that. And my experience is they really feed off that. If you can illustrate that to them. And to the opposite, they won't reveal it if they feel like they're harming you, because they have a real sense of the effect on the therapist that I think goes above and beyond, is maybe a little different than if you're treating just a civilian type of patient.
Yeah, that's that real-time vigilance. They're constantly paying attention to everyone else and the external, right? And the therapist, and they don't have a lot of experience going inward. And I think we have to be able to kind of guide that within their window of tolerance. Because if we push it too fast, all those defenses are going to kick in.
Yeah, and that kind of speaks to the next point, which is, we've discussed a lot about, what the difference is between treating a member of the military or veteran population and then civilian population. And one of those things might be like a civilian is maybe looking for that level of connection and that emotion of, you're feeling the same thing I am. And maybe that's not the case for this population. Like Ben said, they're looking for that strength and that ability to handle those things. So is there anything else really that you would see different in working with civilian population versus military or veteran clients?
Well, I think what's different too is, we all deal with uncertainty in our lives. This population deals with the highest level of uncertainty. They don't, I work also with a lot of special operations folks. They don't know what country they're going to be in, and they can't tell their spouse or their kids, depending on what level of sort of alert that they're on. They don't know what situation they're going to encounter. And so, because of that, and I think it feeds into kind of the vigilance, and there's a lot of other things that I think it feeds into, but getting them, sort of comfortable with uncertainty and understanding that they're going to create certainty in other parts of their lives because there's so much uncertainty in everything else.
Yeah, I think it's harder to get their buy-in because of that uncertainty, the complexities. They got a lot more going on. They're more at risk, right? Addiction, violence, suicide, marital discord. I mean, you add all that stress. I keep going back to the word pacing, but I think it's so hard because we want to help. We just move too fast and we don't kind of recognize we're getting pulled into the same we elicit the same defenses that everyone else gets in them. And to start off really trying to intentionally honor. I love that all of us on the same page, really connecting to the healthy function of how they've learned to kind of navigate the world. And these strategies around avoidance really create a lot of safety and allows them to do their job super well. Like if I don't know what country I'm going in and what's going to happen and what's going to happen to my kids and family I leave behind, like I don't got a lot of time to dwell on that. So seeing the value in that is a great way of connecting first before we try to stretch them or fix them or get them to see something. So that order is really important for me. How do I connect, meet them where they're at instead of where I want them to go?
On this topic, my mind keeps going to one thing that seems especially unique to service members and veterans. It's just not something that civilians can experience, and that's the juxtaposition between and sometimes it's a rapid, stark juxtaposition between military life and civilian life. I noticed this a couple of months ago, even just in I'm also a clinical psychologist for the Army Reserve, and I noticed it in just a 1 month long training where for that month, it was effectively my job to be in the right place at the right time in the right uniform. It was really quite simple in so much it was straightforward. It wasn't always easy, but it was straightforward. I had a set number of responsibilities. I had a high level of responsibility, but it was sort of linear in a sense. In my civilian world, I have myriad responsibilities across many domains. It's you're sort of dividing your attention and your energy in a very different way. And what I find with my recently returning veterans, or with my active duty or my reserve soldiers, is that they transition back to their civilian environment, and they struggle. And it may not be pathological, it may not be depression, it may not be PTSD, it may not be generalized anxiety disorder, but there's a struggle with this new way of dividing one's energy, one's time, one's attention. And they say this is harder, and I don't know why. My job as an infantryman should have been harder, right? Not necessarily. It's a completely different way of operating, and no one else in their life gets that. And when I get that, that going back to the rapport question, going back to the cultural competence question, this kind of brings everything together here. That makes a world of difference. But that is just this uniquely, or this unique experience to the military life, and to that sometimes rapidly toggling military civilian life. That I think is just not something that civilians and therapists who primarily work with civilians may understand. But that if you want to work with service members and veterans, we need to understand that just a bit.
Yeah, it reminds me, I think it's the Hurt Locker when you come back from combat in the supermarket and they just can't pick any. I mean, just the overwhelming kind of. Yeah, I think allow that to impact your heart, what that must be like to be so focused to stay alive and to have all these battle buddies that you're co-regulating with and intense. And then you come back into a world where you're disconnected from that and you got to pick, 20 brands of macaroni and cheese. And how does your brain make that transition to really honor that? Yeah, it's great.
Absolutely. Well, I want to have time to get in a few of these more, specific questions towards each of you as individuals and your specialties. So I guess I'll start here with George. Your area of expertise is couples and family issues. So what are the top 3 issues that you're seeing that military and veteran families are facing today?
It shouldn't be surprising. It's the same issue as all couples face, right? Sex, money, kids, work, the content is the same. And I just think it's more challenged because there's more protective moves. It's easier to kind of what you've been trained to do professionally downrange is just going to show itself in the relationship. And, the partner that's, maybe not serving has also learned all these coping strategies. So the patterns that I would see, the negative patterns of protection, tend to be a little bit more entrenched. But I do want to highlight to your listeners really the importance. Bowlby talks a lot about the 3 behavioral systems being the attachment, the caregiving, and the sexual. And I think for a lot of military, touch is one of the primary ways they feel safe and connected in the world. It's much more than just the orgasm, right? And so often therapists pathologize that. It's like, oh, they just want to have sex. Let's talk about your feelings. They don't recognize this is the primary way they feel connected in the world. And how do we honor that space too? That's how they make a bid to connect. I mean, every session for me is just entering a failed repair attempt yet again. These are the issues that couples can't get on the same page with, they can't repair. And I see our job is to be repair experts. How do we get them kind of pushing in the same direction? And, the more that we can include sex, 70% of therapists don't talk about sex, and yet it's one of the primary ways, especially the military members are going to connect. I think we need to do a better job with that.
Awesome. And Wyatt and Ben, if you have anything to add, go right ahead.
I mean, I think those are great points, especially the sexual functioning piece. Just their sort of desire for sex, just ability to just have sex, right? Is so inhibited, kind of this idea the body keeps a score. And it's so rarely even asked about, but yet it's so profoundly experienced. And there's this real sense of shame and guilt. And it's really affecting, their lives. My experience is they're more concerned with their families being right than they are about the insurgents or the enemy. They're confident in their ability to fight their mission. They're less confident in their ability to be a husband or wife, mother, or father, just due to first of all, not getting the reps in, just because of time and just other, sort of this idea that even when they're home, they're physically there, but they're not mentally there, because what they do is so dangerous. And it's really difficult to do that switching process. And it does affect their families. They're spending their energy during the day, and then they find themselves really irritable at home. And it really negatively impacts them.
Yeah, I love your mission focus. Go ahead, Wyatt.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, the thought that I'm having is that from the perspective of somebody who doesn't have expertise in couples and families in family therapy, what I try to attend to is the very least I can do is provide effective psychoeducation to the family members who are on this healing journey with my veterans, with the veterans that I'm serving. Recovering from PTSD, or a lot of the work that I do around moral injury, it's a social healing process. It's an interpersonal healing process. It's not something that's done in a vacuum. It's something that's done inside of relationships. And so it's necessary to include spouses, kids, parents, friends, people. And so to the degree that I can fold people into that process in an explicit way, I necessarily need to be able to provide them accessible psychoeducation. I necessarily need to be able to respond to their questions and concerns. And so that kind of gets back to this idea of my cultural competence needs to be translatable in such a way that I can make it accessible to them in an efficient and effective way. Those are the thoughts that are coming to my mind as I think about the importance of families in the recovery process.
Yeah, for me, it's so tragic that it's just a setup for both partners, right? If the military member doesn't know how to engage or express their feelings, the other partner is going to feel disconnected. And typically, if you're disconnected, you don't really want to have sex. So then a military member tries to initiate because that's the way they can do vulnerability, and that gets rejected. And both people are frustrated, disconnected, and it's like these patterns just take over. I don't care how much you love each other. If you can't repair that distance, right, all the content issues get thrown your way. It's just going to kind of create more and more of that mistrust and distance. So it's, you know, there's good news, there's ways out of these patterns. And I think that really resonates with a lot of military, that to be able to see patterns, to know there is a mission, there's a way to repair, there's a process like that, that brings out the best part of them, that can tactically see steps and moves and what they can do. And it empowers them instead of kind of freezing them up.
Well, I know we have limited time with you guys here today, so I want to move on to the next couple questions. And this is kind of a good segue into my question for Wyatt, which is, you work a lot with moral injury. Can you describe what that is in the context of military service and why it's important for therapists to assess for it and target it?
Yeah. I mean, so moral injury is a relatively new construct in the psychological literature, but it's by no means a new phenomenon. You know, it's been around as long as humans have. But it's some morally injurious events wherein our core values are violated by, it could be our actions or inactions, it could be someone else's actions or inactions, in war or in operational settings. It's not always, you know, this is not exclusive to military personnel and veterans, but it is particularly prevalent in military personnel and veterans. You know, experiencing these kinds of events produces something called moral pain. It's an excruciating set of emotions such as shame, contempt, disgust, anger, hatred, resentment. And you know, all the thoughts that go along with are you know, condemnation, and really just pretty destructive, damning, toxic sorts of thoughts. And these are not uncommon. They are often misdiagnosed, and I'm going to sort of put that in quotes because I'm not advocating that we diagnose moral pain. But when our service members and veterans get wrapped up in their moral pain, when they over-identify with it, when they come to see themselves as broken, or when they become disillusioned with humanity, that's when their pain gives way to the lived suffering of moral injury. And that is a debilitating and degrading human experience. But when we mislabel it, mischaracterize it as PTSD, as depression, or when it co-occurs with substance use or what have you, and we focus primarily on that, we overlook the unique experience that is moral injury, and we may target it in ways that at best overlook, miss the target, and at worst exacerbate some of those moral emotions. And so I think it's imperative that we not only learn how to assess for that unique experience, but then learn how to respond to it in a direct and intentional way. So we're still learning how to best do that, but there's enough data out there now. There's some training out there now. So I think that that's worthwhile for folks who are you know, doing a lot of work with military personnel and or veterans.
No, I totally agree, especially if you're treating a population of heavily deployed patients, or ones that have been really involved in some really muddy leadership situations where many of them have become very well known in the media. You know, Vanessa Guillen, you know, there's a lot of stuff out there. And that's just the things that the media is reporting. You know, there's many other things, you know, just like any organization, there's always challenges and there's always things that we're going to be overcoming, especially when we're working with young people in complicated moral situations.
Yeah, I'll go back to our theme here is get more training, right? I think a lot of therapists have training with fear-based or loss-based kind of trauma, but don't with moral injuries. And I mean, to me, there's a lot of research how it's the most extreme, right? When existentially your values are betrayed, your whole world gets turned upside down. I mean, that needs more focused training, and a lot of us, haven't gotten the work that we need to do to get that.
Absolutely.
No, that's exactly right. Moral emotions don't respond to traditional interventions that target, the extinction of fear, for example. We have powerful interventions for extinguishing fear, that's part and parcel of PTSD, but that's not a tool that's typically going to be effective for, ameliorating shame or helping someone to hold guilt and regret more compassionately. And so we need some alternatives, and they're out there. We just need the training.
Maybe a great spot for a little spirituality of faith to integrate, right? Where typically other areas you wouldn't.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Well, I want to get to this last question for Ben. Your specialty is chronic pain. Can you tell us how chronic pain and trauma are related, and what that potentially means for the training needs of therapists who wish to work with military service members and veterans?
Sure. I mean, kind of the mantra that we use in our programs here is we treat the whole patient and not just the hole in the patient. And that really, when you look at a lot of these mechanisms in the brain, for example, chronic pain and trauma, they share neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. So what ends up happening, they're negatively synergistic. So sort of like this chronic pain experience makes your trauma worse, the trauma makes your pain worse. There's a high base rate for the experience of both. In some studies, up to 50% of deployed cohorts have both chronic pain and some sort of acute stress disorder, PTSD. And so really conceptualizing them as one, because when there's multiple studies of brain imaging where we look at sort of the experience of what we would call quote unquote physical pain versus emotional pain. And when we look at a functional MRI or PET scan, we can't tell the difference. And so what we really want to do is, what we do here is kind of treat both simultaneously to understand, like, for example, if we have chronic pain, avoidance is a piece of that. Like, I don't want to do stuff, I don't want to physically move or perform. And the same thing with PTSD, we want to emotionally avoid things, right? There's a vigilance that's involved in both. There's so many, really when you look at it, they overlap each other, and there's so many different models. There's at least 7 different models that conceptualize them as being one, whether it's a mutual maintenance model, like I said, or the pathophysiological model, and just kind of jumping in there and understand that so often the 2 pathways that are looked at, suffering, and there's kind of this physical experience of pain. And so we have these different level of providers. Like behavioral health traditionally looks at the suffering piece of it. So we want to teach, like the acceptance of it, but we don't hit the other side of it. There's a huge behavioral piece, physiological piece, understanding the pain neuroscience education. And I think behavioral health, we stand really uniquely because pain is an output of the brain 100% of the time, but it relies on input from the body. And so it's going to take a lot of training because, especially chronic pain, this is based on, like I said, that interaction and not necessarily just what's happening in the tissues. And it has to do with suffering. It has to do with previous experiences. It changes the way your brain works. And so people with severe chronic pain can have 1 in 3 thoughts, about their bodily pain. But oftentimes the brain will also use that as a mechanism to avoid the emotional pain, because the emotional pain is worse often than the physical pain, and it's less socially acceptable, especially in the military population. So you really have to dig into all the stuff that we've talked about. I address moral injury. We address sexual functioning, low-grade headaches. There's certain things that you really want to look out for because it also affects their ability to take, for example, if they're seeing a physical therapist and they want to do dry needling. If you have a high degree of central sensitization from PTSD, they're just not going to tolerate lots of treatments out there. And it just takes, I think, especially if your background's not in clinical health psychology or another medical profession, it's going to take some extra training because no single profession really owns chronic pain. It cuts across everything from physical therapy, occupational therapy, physical medicine, psychology, and it touches every area of your life.
Yeah. I love you highlighting that connection between, physical and emotional pain, suffering, because I think a lot of us have been trained to see them as separate entities. And I think in Naomi Eisenberger's work, if you're rejected, it lands the same part of the brain as physical pain. So taking aspirin works just as well. Like, that's kind of mind blowing for me, the way I was originally trained. So I love that you're emphasizing that.
I appreciate too the sort of the mantra from the beginning, about treating the whole person, not the whole in the person. Because the fact of the matter is the base rate of comorbidity in our population is really high, whether it be just chronic pain and any psychological condition, but also sleep problems, other medical problems, substance use issues. I mean, really, just you name it. And it may not just be two of those; it may be many of those. And being able to attend to all of them and have the skill set to respond to all of them, or the awareness at the very least, and the attitude that allows you to collaborate with others to respond to all of them. I think that's an imperative in working with this group of folks.
All righty. Well, thank you guys so much for being here with us today and having this awesome discussion. I think it's really beneficial for everyone. And if the viewers out there are interested in learning more and even hearing more from our panel of experts, they can check out PESI's Certified Veteran and Military Mental Health Professional certification and training to get that more in-depth experience and training for working with this population. So thank you guys so much for being here with us today. And we look forward to hearing more from you later on.
All right. Thanks.
Y'all be well.